Welcome to this explainer. When we think of the First World War, our minds usually jump straight to the muddy trenches of the Western Front. But today, we're looking east. We're going to unpack the staggering geographical scale, the absolute logistical nightmares, and the extraordinary human sacrifice of the Ottoman Empire's World War I campaigns. We're talking about an empire fighting for its literal survival across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, struggling just as much against its own decaying infrastructure as it did against the Allied powers. Okay, let's look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Ottomans in the global war, then break down the first-degree fronts, followed by the cross-border fronts. After that, we'll look at the logistics and infrastructure collapse, and finally, the human loss and sacrifice. So Part 1, the Ottomans in global war. To really grasp the Ottoman war effort, you have to look at the sheer, mind-boggling scale of it all. The math here is truly staggering. They started the war with a standing army of only about 210,000 soldiers. But despite facing severe human resource shortages plus major technological and economic limits, they somehow managed to mobilize over 3 million men. They pulled in peasants, teenagers, and elderly men, drafting this massive force from an agrarian society that honestly struggled to feed itself even in peacetime. But having 3 million men on paper is one thing. Actually deploying them is a whole different story. These millions of soldiers were spread incredibly thin. The Ottoman Empire fought across 8 primary fronts on their own soil and in cross-border regions. Actually, if you separate the European theaters, some military classifications count up to 10 distinct fronts. Across these vast, sprawling landscapes, the army engaged in roughly 100 battles of varying sizes from the start of the war right to the bitter end. Moving on to Section 2, First-Degree Fronts. Now, we can basically categorize all these massive conflicts into 2 distinct arenas. First, we have the first-degree fronts. These were fought strictly on home soil, places like the Caucasus, Gallipoli, Iraq, Syria-Palestine, and Hijaz, Yemen. Then we had the second-degree, or cross-border fronts, like Iran, Galicia, Macedonia, and Romania, where they sent expeditionary forces to aid their allies. Let's zoom in on those primary home soil fronts first. If we just look at the Gallipoli campaign alone, we see a dizzying blitz of intense amphibious and trench warfare. The Allies initiated this to force open the Dardanelles Strait and threaten the capital, Constantinople. It featured the massive March 18th naval operations, followed by legendary land clashes at places like Anafartalar, Konkbari, Kumkale, and Sedilbahir. The Ottomans successfully defended the straits, establishing a fierce military reputation, but it came at a huge cost. There were massive casualties on both sides, with the trenches locked in a brutal stalemate for 8 months. Meanwhile, over in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, the Ottomans fought to protect their oil fields and block British advances. Early clashes at Basra led to the fierce 147-day siege of Kut al-Lamara. This was a major Ottoman victory. Imagine an 8,000-strong British and Indian garrison completely surrounded, eventually forced to surrender due to starvation and disease. It was a massive shock to the British, though, as we know, they eventually regrouped, pushed north, and took Baghdad the following year. And we absolutely cannot forget the other critical home fronts. Up in the Caucasus, combat was incredibly complicated. They weren't just fighting the Russians at extreme altitudes, they were dealing with devastating regional instability and tragic massacres against local Turkish populations. Later on, the Islamic army of the Caucasus would actually push all the way to Baku. Down south, you had ambitious campaigns in Sinai-Palestine, including the intense battles of Gaza and Megiddo. And in the Hijaz Yemen front, we see incredible endurance, perfectly highlighted by Fahrettin Pasha's years-long defense of Medina against the British-backed Arab revolt. Let's shift gears to Section 3, Cross-Border Fronts. So beyond their own borders, the Ottomans deployed entire army corps, specifically the 15th, 20th, and 6th Corps, to places like Galicia, Macedonia, and Romania. Why? To aid their German and Austro-Hungarian allies in bitter trench warfare against Russian, British, French, and Serbian troops. They fought in fierce joint defenses, like holding the line in the Berezjani region in Galicia. This really shows an army that wasn't just fighting for survival at home, but was actively projecting power and fulfilling alliance obligations abroad, despite dealing with massive shortages back home. This brings us to Section 4, Logistics and Infrastructure Collapse. Okay, this comparison is just stark. During World War I, European armies typically had 10 logistical personnel supporting every single combatant. 10 to 1. The Ottoman reality was shockingly different. They had to rely heavily on pack animals and a small number of unarmed civilian labor battalions, known as the Amala Taburu. When you're fighting a global industrial war, lacking organized logistical manpower like this is a glaring, fatal disadvantage.
Supply transport was literally an absolute nightmare. The empire relied on a single-track railway that wasn't even fully connected. Imagine moving troops and food. You load supplies in Istanbul, unload them where the tracks end, march across the gap, reload everything, and then do it all over again when the track gauge changes. Because of this agonizing process, the Ottoman Second Army lost nearly half of its effective combat strength to disease, desertion, and starvation during its deployment to the Caucasus front. Half their strength gone before they even saw the enemy.
Finally, Section 5, Human Loss and Sacrifice. To truly understand the brutal reality of fighting without proper winter gear or supply lines, consider the Battle of Surakhomish in the Caucasus. Driven by an ambitious strategy to encircle the Russians, Ottoman troops were forced on these brutal marches through snow-covered mountains. Roughly 25,000 Ottoman soldiers froze to death in the extreme cold. 25,000. And that was before a single shot was even fired in the main battle. It's a haunting testament to the extraordinary sacrifices of the Turkish soldiers under impossibly harsh conditions. When we break down the overall casualties, a tragic and jarring fact emerges. Over 243,000 soldiers were killed in direct combat, but that number is completely dwarfed by the massive amount of deaths resulting from disease. Over 466,000 men died from disease alone. Let that sink in. That single staggering statistic perfectly illustrates how the collapse of medical and logistical support systems, the lack of food, clean water, and basic medicine, was literally deadlier than enemy fire. The Ottoman military had fewer than 2,500 doctors for an army of 3 million. The resilience of the troops fighting under these conditions across 100 battles is almost impossible to comprehend. The Ottoman soldiers fought across multiple continents, enduring unbelievable hardships, massive casualties, and catastrophic supply failures, yet they held together as a fighting force until the very end of 1918. As we wrap up this explainer, it leaves us with a provocative question to ponder. If their logistical network in industrial capacity had actually matched the extraordinary resilience of the men in the trenches, how different might the map of the modern Middle East look today? Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the history behind the facts.